Hey there, everyone. So, as I'm sure you've all probably seen by now, Jeffrey Epstein, billionaire financier, documented pedophile who was known to have connections to various sex trafficking rings and politicians, who actually had his own private island dedicated specifically to inviting some of his state friends over for only God knows what sort of perverted debauchery, was arrested around mid to late June of this year, 2019, on these charges, and today, August 10th, 2019, at around 6:30 a.m. local time in New York, was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell from a, quote, apparent suicide. Now, of course, there are many things which happened in between his arrest and his death. Most notably, he was put on suicide watch and was under and as such was under 24/7 surveillance and was not able to have any items he could potentially kill himself with in his jail cell. And on top of that, he also had signed a plea deal in which he was going to name off some very influential political figures who were connected to some of the things that he did. Most notably, Bill Clinton. It's obvious who Bill Clinton is. Famous lawyer Alan Dershowitz, and Larry Summers, the former vice president of World Bank. And here is where it gets interesting. And all of these names were revealed through the publicly available logs of the passengers for the Lolita Express, the name he gave to his private jet that took him and his passengers to his private island where he hosted this sex ring. God, what a sick fucking pervert. I'd almost say that I'm glad he's dead, but as noted earlier, Epstein was going to testify in a plea deal against dozens of very influential political figures and the sex trafficking rings they were involved in, or possibly, most likely, were financing and organizing themselves. And the night that Epstein died, being that he was under constant 24/7 surveillance, along with not being allowed to have anything in his cell because, well, he was on suicide watch, he was being recorded constantly, so you think that we'd have a clear picture of what happened. Well, no, apparently, just out of pure coincidence, that particular night where Epstein committed suicide, or allegedly committed suicide, the camera, quote-unquote, malfunctioned and none of the footage was saved. What a big fucking coincidence. So now, nothing is going to be revealed, and no testimony from Epstein revealing his connections, his contacts' connections, or who was running and financing these sex trafficking rings is going to happen, and that's more or less the end of the story. Now, for those of you who didn't see it, a few months ago, Filthy Heretic and I put out a collaborative video essay entitled "The Most Disgusting Thing the Government is Currently Doing," in which case we provide a more than a compelling case to support the claim that Child Protective Services is making up arbitrary excuses to kidnap people's children because the government creates quotas for every state regarding the amount of federal funding each state's social services receive in relation to the number of children the local governments in question have taken into custody that year through Child Protective Services. And this is because these CPS-run or connected foster homes are used as child sex trafficking rings and as tools to put these children on expensive psychoactive medication at the birth parent's expense. The purpose of doing this is to bolster revenue for the state's off-the-record expenditures and to attempt and arbitrarily expand demand for these pharmaceutical cartels established by the state through all of these regulations and licensing laws, which created artificial scarcity in the medical industry and make it near impossible to even enter that market due to costs alone. Why I bring this up is firstly because that video gained about 2,000 views within roughly the first 48 hours after being uploaded, but then mysteriously stopped gaining views at that same rate. So clearly it's been shadow banned, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask that you all go ahead and give that a watch and share it as far and wide as possible, because what we've presented is frankly too damning to be quietly ignored like YouTube and the state intends on having happened. But also because I would argue that while Clinton and all of these other political elites were definitely connected to Epstein, what his testimony would have revealed about them is not anything we couldn't have already deduced based on the fact that their names were on the publicly available flight logs for Epstein's private jet. Personally, based on Epstein's political connections and what sort of activity we know he was involved in, I think part of his testimony would have established financial connections between these various political figures who went to his island and these child protective services run sex trafficking rings. Hell, it's even possible that the sex ring Epstein had on his island itself was connected to CPS, and that's where he got some of these victims from. And even though evidence of the state doing this is already widely available, since this was such a high-profile case where essentially everybody was watching, this would have revealed what Filthy and I exposed a few months back to a mainstream audience, which would have then essentially forced a series of narrative-shattering realizations down the throats of normies and people who bought into the state's controlled opposition narratives, which is that this sort of shit isn't corruption of the system or a deep state, but that the state itself is driven to do this sort of evil shit because the state as an entity requires exponential growth to sustain itself, and as a parasitic firm, the more it uses force to appropriate resources as tax revenue, the less wealth that non-state actors can generate from white market trading due to the artificial scarcity this creates. So that paradoxically encourages people to find ways to trade around the state in order to sustain a living for themselves. The state can't just take 100% of everyone's incomes. Well, they could, but everyone would either just leave the country or more than likely would start trading under the table. So to circumvent this little structural defect, the state attempts to cartelize certain consistently high-demand industries such as gasoline or pharmaceuticals, or industries which the state can manipulate geopolitical events or the market surrounding them in order to turn into high-demand industries, such as arms manufacturing, in order to increase the revenue which the state obtains from trade within these industries. And this would expose the fact that everything the state does is in fact not determined by the ideology of the politicians who run the state, or some sort of attempt to represent the interests of non-state actors, but rather the state and every state actor operate around a hegemonic set of interests, which is based around sustaining the state. And these hegemonic set of interests are necessarily antagonistic towards non-state actors. So, I'd argue there's a good chance that Epstein's testimony would have pretty much single-handedly smashed the illusion that the state existing somehow, quote-unquote, represents the interests of the population, and of the electoral system being beneficial to engage in to have your material interests met, and in turn would have collapsed the already crumbling socio-political order. Now, this leads me to the main point I wanted to establish, which I found that no one else was talking about or attempting to establish themselves. Isn't it really fucking weird that every politician, every state-sponsored media outlet, or personality are all openly trying to push the same notion that Epstein's suicide was not really a suicide? Why exactly is it that not only is this story being represented through the state narratives by questioning the Manhattan jail's official story, but also that this story is front page news on every major state-connected media outlet and is more or less all they're talking about? Because what that suggests is two things. One, something about the way in which the story is being spun by the media and politicians is beneficial for the state, and that the state specifically wants everyone to focus on this story, which itself, historically, based on the state's typical mode of operation, means that it's doing something which it doesn't want people to focus on or call a lot of attention to. So, I would have uploaded this video probably only a few hours after the story broke, but because of this, I had to do some looking around and pondering over the possible narratives being conveyed and how it could benefit the state under the two previously noted factors to have everyone thinking about and fixated on this story. Well, firstly, for historical purposes, this story might still be pretty interesting, but for its relevance in relation to current issues, that's about it. Epstein's dead, so nothing that would have been exposed by his testimony is going to come to light, i.e. all of the details which we don't already know, because no testimony is going to happen, and all we have are the publicly available flight logs of the Lolita Express, which I'll go ahead and link in the description for anyone who's curious. We don't know exactly what's going to happen now, but hypothetically speaking, let's just say that the DOJ does publicly start an investigation into Epstein's suicide, and let's say that the conclusion the DOJ publicly reaches in their findings is that they suspect it was a murder, and even somebody goes down, like Bill Clinton, and actually does end up going to jail, which, to make it perfectly clear, there is absolutely no way that this is going to happen, but again, we're just taking this into consideration for the sake of making a point, I guess. Well, we know for certain that any of the establishment media outlets who actually talk about this story will attempt to present a narrative that whoever went down was just a crooked and individually motivated actor, and that the state being run correctly is intended to be just and represent everyone's interests simultaneously, and give you rubber duckies and chicken tendies and mommy's cummies. But also, again, nothing which this investigation could reveal would bring anything to light that we don't already know, because, again, Epstein is dead, and the important part of this story was based around what he was going to testify as part of his plea deal. So if you really take the time to dissect the narratives and information being presented, there's nothing to be gained from this story which hasn't already been known for years, and the only narrative that the state's going to run with going forward would in fact be one designed to bolster its own interests, which is to make people think that the state's interests are not inherently antagonistic towards their own. In other words, there's nothing of substance actually being conveyed here, which leaves us to the second established point. This is clearly a distraction intended to make people forget about various political events which happened recently, or cracks in the narratives of other stories promoted by state media, along with various new legislation being promoted. Like how it was revealed that Fox ran a story about the El Paso shooting 26 minutes before even the El Paso police reported that there had been a shooting, that the El Paso Shooters Manifesto was never actually posted to 8chan and instead was posted on Instagram through a now deleted account, Trump creating an executive order explicitly to have the FCC and FTC nationalize the internet and have the government establish effectively a universal TOS, and so now you're gonna have to have a license to start a website on the proprietary internet. The current social media sites are going to be sponsored by the state, and you can be arrested or fined for posting content the government doesn't like. National red flag laws, which is just an open legal gun confiscation, and all of the absolute garbage surrounding that situation, or the TAPS Act, which is essentially just the US's equivalent of the social credit system in China. I mean, the government has been going so crazy lately, you really could pick any number of these, and the Epstein story was probably intended to divert attention away from it. Which, by the way, this week's episode of the Cool Capitalist Kids podcast goes more into detail about all these little bits of previously mentioned information, and that'll be uploaded on Monday. Anyway, that's all for today's video. I will see you all next time.